area. So you like yeah, sure. It's 40 so that's a big driver.
All right. Have a seat if you like. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. I think it's about 4 o'clock, or some people would call it 4 o'clock instead of 4 o'clock. So let me just do some housekeeping and talk about what's coming up. October 6th, we're going to do Understanding the Land Bank. So Kevin Canty is going to come and talk about the land bank, what it is, why it's needed. I'm reading this from the website. Plymouth already has some of the most restricted residential zonings in the entire Commonwealth, and still new subdivisions are being built. That's because Plymouth can't prevent developers from building what's allowed by existing residential zoning. Moreover, our commercial zoning is being land is being converted into apartments through an affordable housing loophole called Chapter 40B. So the land bank is an attempt to get money so that Plymouth can start purchasing property. That's the 6th. On the 3rd of November, we're calling it the State of the Fourth Estate. So Mark Pothier, Robbie Robinson, who is the guy who saw the Spotlight feature, he was, I'm trying to remember the name of the actor who was the main actor. He's the editor. Michael Keaton. Michael Keaton, thank you. And Troy Finn are going to come talk about local media, or lack thereof, what the Independent is trying to do to address this media desert that is occurring across the United States for local communities. So that's on the 3rd. On the 12th, we're hoping to talk about planning for the Holtec property. So the town is, I believe, secured a grant to plan for the Holtec property. So they have put out an RFP to get a consultant to help them plan. So hopefully we'll have somebody come in and talk about that. And the 23rd, the wastewater treatment folks are going to hopefully give an update. They have had a meeting, or they will maybe have their first real meeting next Monday at 6. And there was something on the latest newsletter about that. So that's on the 23rd. But today,
Excuse me, Mark.
Yeah.
And so if you want to kind of sandwich in between there, you know, this handicap, tomorrow night's an handicap meeting, and we have it bi-monthly, right? And if at some point in there, if you want to, like I did before, if you want to have an update on where we are with the decommissioning,
Cool.
I'd be more than happy to kind of provide that short update.
That sounds great.
If you want to sandwich it into maybe whenever it's feasible.
No, that sounds great. Other folks interested in where the decommissioning thing is at? It's a rowdy crowd. Yes. Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, let's see. Oh, I was going to talk about smart growth. So today, Stephen Cole, Executive Director of the Plymouth Foundation, which is a private nonprofit organization dedicated to enhancing the quality of life in our region through smart economic growth. He's going to conduct the Foundation's effort to preserve the character of our community by actively supporting government and private sector initiatives to attract, retain, and strengthen employment opportunities, and increase the community's commercial and industrial tax base. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, unless folks have questions, comments.
Oh, this crowd definitely does. I know a few.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, we got more chairs if anybody wants them. Okay, and we're streaming this for sure this time, so I'm going to get out so people don't have to look at the back of my head.
How many people are streaming, Mark? What's the international audience?
I think it's probably 0, but the good news is, hold on.
It's preserved for posterity.
Yeah, we'll post this out on the site so folks can watch it. Yeah, it doesn't look like anybody's tuned in but we are recording.
All right. So as Mark said, I'm Steve Cole. I'm really just some guy, and I relish that role of mine. But I have a really cool job. It might be the first or second coolest job in town. I get to be the Economic Development Director for the Plymouth Regional Economic Development Foundation. But that's way too much to say. No one's into it, so we shorthand ourselves and say the Plymouth Foundation. You'll see on the screen our logo, which is a chevron of a shovel. Everyone knows that economic development term, shovel ready, right? We adopted the shovel as our chevron, as our logo, along with green and blue as our colors, because we are telling the world that Plymouth is shovel ready for the green-blue economy. We're not looking to do things like other post-industrial cities. We have a 400-year history of doing things a certain way. Most of what economic development is or should be, it's inherently democratic. It's different in Plymouth as it is in Carver, as it is in Saugus, right? I mean, each of these communities has different trajectories, different roles, different purposes. I am going to go through a bit of an agenda, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we mean by competitive and sustainable. I personally have been spent 20 years in economic development, specifically at the municipal level. Started my career in Springfield, though I did grow up on Cape Cod. I called Cape Cod, in fact, Peninsular Plymouth for a lot of years, to the chagrin of some of my Cape Cod friends. But I refer to Plymouth as continental Cape Cod, much to their chagrin also. I do that because the ecosystems, the histories, the politics, substantively, and the economy are pretty intimately connected. But for that little strip of water that separates us, we actually have a really strong interconnection with our labor pool. 3% of Plymouth's labor force goes to Cape Cod every day to work. 11% drive north to Boston. I'm going to go into some of those nuances in a second, but first I kind of want to get into a little bit more about what the foundation is. We are organized as a 501c3 nonprofit foundation. That's really important. Every one of those words. We're a nonprofit. We are not tied to the government, except that I have 3 seats that are reserved for the town elders, so to speak, the chair of the select board, the town manager, and the department head of the planning and community development office. That's Dick Quintal, Derek Brindisi, and Lee Hartman. But by virtue of their jobs, they have seats, regardless of who is in that role. Okay. So we're not tied to the government. We are a nonprofit. If the town decided tomorrow to create a Department of Economic Development, we would not go away. We have a mission. We're organized and recognized by the IRS. We have mission and goal and purposes. The town just reserves 3 seats, and it's important that anything that we do is essentially deemed as though it has town approval. We don't have a split board. Before we go to vote, I think it's important that you know we really laboriously ad nauseum discuss things. And then when it's ready for a permit or something that's public consumption, at that point, then typically do we go to vote and have some kind of public discussion or discourse. There's a project active right now in Cedarville that some of you are already aware about. That's one example of a time where we might work with the town as a fee for service, so to speak, right? Where we could be hired as project managers. The same thing happened, in fact, in Carver. Carver doesn't have an economic development department, so they came to us and they asked us if we would help facilitate certain zone changes to help them get their urban renewal plan to the finish line. That's a lot of nonsense for the most part, but that's a plan that was being planned for 30 years, but they needed certain zoning in place in order to make it palatable or developable. So that's some of the services that we offer, but also as a foundation, it's important to note that we are obligated by the IRS to put our assets back into the community. We don't make money. We're a nonprofit foundation, which means we have to put the money back into the community, about 5% over a 3-year period. We're allowed to hoard for about 5 years as long as we present to the IRS that we have some kind of a plan. But for the most part, the last 5 or 10 years, the foundation hasn't really had any money. We're a very small nonprofit fee for service. This is my board of directors. If you know anyone on there, I'll ask you to raise your hand. Sure. So we have Bill Halsey, owner of Shiretown Glass, Jay Kimball, who owns Wood Seafood down at the waterfront, Kevin O'Reilly, America's Own. We have Derek Brindisi, Lee Hartman, and Dick Quintal, the aforementioned town folks. Amy Naples, who is the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce. Charlie Wall, I know everyone here knows Charlie, right? Retired college president. State Rep Matt Muratori, independent of his position as a state rep, he's on the board. He's a small business owner, former selectman, and a resident of the town. Jack Meal, who is an OG banker, so to speak, heavy into the finance sectors. Dee Spencer, again, who ran for office recently, but had nothing to do with the foundation. That was a decision she made on her own. Rick Veo, who is a local developer. And then we have a seat, an emeritus role for Eddie Santos, who passed last year. Eddie was my full-time board member. He was in the office every day. So if you know someone on there, raise your hand. You don't have to like them. I'm just saying if you know them. Perfect. So independent of what you may think of these individuals, it does represent for the most part a cross-section of the community that is Plymouth, the one Plymouth. Some of the developers you see here, like Bill Hallisey and Rick Veo, I mean, that's 2 developers out of 13 seats. They certainly do not dominate any part of the conversation. And I will say one of the things I feel that I contribute to the conversation, having spent time in these post-industrial inelastic cities like Springfield and Hartford, you can do really meaningful things to enhance your economy without building a single building or cutting down a single tree. Sometimes those things are necessary. It's not really for me to say. There's a whole public process, in fact, that's set up that's inclusive of Conservation Commission and planning and sometimes earth removal committees, building commissioners, and even sometimes selectmen. So there's a whole process that's set up that ultimately determines whether it's necessary or appropriate to cut down trees. One of the things I'm very proud of, though, is that we focus on things other than development. We own 1 property now, and it's only because the town asked us to, because the town did not have the technical capacity to develop the site. So otherwise, though, this is essentially what we focus on. Small business development, land use, which is, of course, the zoning stuff, workforce development, entrepreneurship, and what I call MECCA, marketing, events, and cultural assets. MECCA is especially important in a tourism community. Other cities and towns that I've lived and worked, they were desperate for things like this. They faked that they had some kind of a tourism base, but they didn't. They may have one asset like the Basketball Hall of Fame, but how do you get there when you're separated by a whole highway? You know, there are some things that you really can't do when you have certain assets, but Plymouth has so many assets and there's so many opportunities to gain access to them that we actually adopted MECCA as one of our core economic development practices portfolio. Okay? I'm going to talk to you today, though, about only a handful of these things. Mark, you mentioned the Holtec Master Plan. I'm glad to say that I worked with Lee Hartman and I wrote that grant with him. We submitted it. I can talk a little bit about that tonight, and it does necessitate some more information. So I'd be glad to come back and we can talk about what that looks like. Okay, but I want to talk to you about the Blue Future Conference, Holtec Master Plan, the town policies and personnel, because as I said, we work together. And I want to talk to you about what's happening up at Corbridge Park, because I'm not sure everyone here really knows about the depth of what's happening here. Before I jump into it, though, I want to talk about some of those value-added things that you can do to enhance your economy. We did a series of studies when I first came on board, just before the pandemic. During the pandemic, we had a lot of time to study stuff. There was a lot of old data that we could dive through. So what we learned was that the arts economy is grossly underrepresented in Plymouth. This is an opportunity where we could really enhance our economic output by having things like, well, a poet laureate. We didn't have one before. This organization actually created the first poet laureate in Plymouth. His name was Stephen Delbos. Wildly successful program. After 4 years, we selected our second poet laureate, Miriam O'Neill. If you don't know Miriam, you must get to know Miriam. There was one vendor. This was a test case, so to speak. How do you get people into downtown on our shoulder nights, Mondays and Tuesdays, so the slowest nights in town? I can't even bring people out to lunch many times if they come to visit me in the office, because most restaurants are closed until 4 if they open at all on Mondays and Tuesdays. There's one particular location, I won't tell you, but they had a poet laureate night. They hosted the poet laureate. It was the highest grossing night this person ever had on a Tuesday. Not hard to do, right? But it was the highest grossing night before 7 o'clock that they ever had. And all they did was have poetry, something to entice people in. So that's one example of how you can really enhance your economic output. A few times when we have these poet laureate events, I'll ask the crowd how many people drove into town. Almost more than half of people always come into town. Then I ask how many people came out to dinner beforehand or intend to afterwards. Almost everyone in the room raises their hands. So having a fun event like that that's cultured and it's refined and celebrates who we are without being divisive, it gets people out of their homes on a night they might not otherwise. It makes them spend money on things that they might not otherwise. And it helps them have fun and have memorable things that they can post on Instagram, which of course helps the brand of the community, right? The one Plymouth community is what I mean. So the other thing that we did to kind of prepare the long-term economy for Plymouth, and when you hear these stats, I'll tell you in a second, you'll understand why we're doing this, but we helped create the fifth grade children's business fair. We're now going into our 3rd year. When I say we helped create it, we never would have got this thing off the ground if we didn't have amazing partners at Plymouth Public Schools. But during the pandemic, that's something that I worked on with my board and that we launched as soon as the pandemic was over. So now, we're at a point where 4th graders, as soon as they graduate, they know that in 5th grade, They have a business fair to look forward to, and some of these kids work over the summer on their plans and ideas. I got an email from a young woman whose son participated last year. He's 11 years old. In the email, she said that after the fair, her son continued with his business, changed his product lines based on feedback, and he was able to raise enough money to buy a tent or reserve a booth at the Waterfront Festival, Plymouth's premier summer event. 20,000 people come. This kid was able to raise enough money to get a booth, and he participated as a business, a small business. And she says in her email, her son learns more than she ever thought an 11-year-old could learn. This kid is talking to her about business taxes. So that's one consequence. We're now going into our third year. What I'm excited about is we're keeping our finger on the pulse. That first year group of kids, they're going to be participating soon in another type of business fair we're hoping to launch by the time they get to high school. Essentially what we're doing is we're laying the groundwork for fifth graders to think of themselves as small business owners and entrepreneurs. Because when I was a kid, I was told when I graduated high school, you can go to college, join the clergy, join the military, or get a job. No one ever really told me I could create my own job. But at this point, at 42, oh my God, I have so much other things that I have to worry about in debts. I can't think of myself that way. That's scary to me. But when you do something and you're in fifth grade, it's not scary to you as an adult. Hell, you've already run a successful business and made some money. All you have to do is position your opinions and ideas a little bit to look at a program or a product that will make you success as an adult now, right? So building on that theme, one of the things I want to kind of harp on is the entrepreneurial element that I showed you a second ago. We hired, we got a $300,000 grant from USEDA to study entrepreneurship in Plymouth. It was my instinct, based on what I had seen anecdotally, that this community is deeply entrepreneurial. But we needed to know some things. Who do we have in our community that is entrepreneurial? What are they working on? What resources are they using? And what resources do they need in order to scale up? And UMass Donahue Institute out of Amherst responded to that RFP. We gave them all the money that we got from the feds, and they gave us a really great comprehensive report about who we are. Who are we? Well, before the pandemic, the median household income in town was about $85,000. Since the pandemic, it's about $115,000. Without nodding or acknowledging, did anybody in this room really get that much richer during the pandemic? Or did people, do you think, moved in and moved the bar on all of us? Yeah, probably the latter, right? So let's just presume that most town folks are still at about $85,000 a year, living in a world that's meant for people making $165,000 a year. Because that's what you need to be earning as a household to afford the $695,000 median household price in town. Right? Before the pandemic, it was pretty close, a very palatable $500,000 or so. The prices, of course, increase. We all know why, right? I'm going to pause here for a second to tell you some weird stuff about Plymouth's growth trajectory that you may not have known. Michelle's kind of smiling because I might have told you some of these things before, and you know my numbers are, right?
You're fine.
So when that pilgrim group stepped off that boat to the time the first census taker knocked on the doors, that span of time is 170 years, okay? Plymouth grew by 17 people on average per year for 170 years. That's true. For continuity's sake, for the next 170 years, Plymouth grew on average 67 people per year. And people were dying at like 35 back then, right? Just from breathing or opening windows. Anything could do you in. For the last 50 years, and I say 50 because that's when the PowerPoint was operating, for the last 50 years, this town has grown 911 people per year on average. And the town has issued over 2,000 single-family home permits by right over the last 5 years. And that's how we get to 65,000 people. There were 15,000 people in this town when that power plant turned on the switch. 15,000. That's all the Pilgrim descendants, all the Anglo-Irish, all the Portuguese, all the Italians, all the Armenians, that's everyone. 15,000 people, and now we're at 65,000 in 2 generations. That power plant was a pretty significant economic development project for this community. Whether we wanted it or not, whether you anticipated it or not, the fact remains, it did a thing to this community that changed it forever. I do believe the Holtec Master Plan, it is a public process, we'll talk a little bit more about it in a second, but I do believe that the decommissioning of that power plant will be as instrumental. Growth is happening to you. It's happening to you right now. One of the things that I'm so enamored by and endeared by this community is, I mean, some people don't even realize it, but Plymouth is essentially already a city. Every other community in Massachusetts is a post-industrial city. They have brownfields. Can't even do enough with them, right? Not even enough money to do anything with them. You got to dig down to the bedrock 35 feet to do something with them. Plymouth isn't that. but we have 65,000 people. And if you look at the list of the top 25 communities based on population in the Commonwealth, we're number 16. We're number 16 out of 351 cities and towns. And we're the only town on the list of the top 25. Everyone else is a city. So for all intents and purposes, a rose by any other name is still a rose, I understand. We are essentially the city of Springfield, but our town government is organized in a different way. All right? How do I know we're urbanizing in real time? We have a permanent and entrenched homeless population in the downtown. That's part of our economic development portfolio now. We have to live with this or we have to solve this. We have permanent graffiti in our downtown. We can do something about it or we don't, but the fact is it's there all the time now, and it's a common tag. I grew up in my career in urban environments. Graffiti was a big problem in Springfield. I'm trained to recognize a single common tag because it gives you an indicator of, oh, well, that's someone's territory. That's a unique individual's territory, right? The other thing that's happening, we have a housing crisis, right? In fact, the state says we have a few crises. We have a water crisis, housing crisis, energy crisis, food crisis. In fact, if Massachusetts gets cut off tomorrow from the rest of the world, we have fewer than a full day's worth of calories to sustain all of us, right? We're in trouble. So part of the economic development strategy that we're employing with the foundation to identify these crises that the state says we're living under, which we have no doubt that we do. But what are our resources and what are our assets that we can use to help solve some of these problems? Frankly, leaning into entrepreneurship is how we're going to do that. Because government's not going to be the one that solves all these. The foundation's not going to be the one who solves all these. What's going to happen is entrepreneurs are going to come to Plymouth and essentially focus on green-blue economy, try to identify the things that they see as problems, and create solutions and businesses around those solutions. And that's why I'm going to talk about the Blue Future Conference, because that's the third program that we launched as our signature program that's largely intended to promote Plymouth as a place where high-tech businesses and industries can locate, because we have 37 miles of coastline. No other community boasts nearly that much. And I spent a lot of time in the Commonwealth. I'm from here. If you go north of Quincy, that's a very industrialized coastline. In fact, my favorite city in the world is Salem, of course. I lived there before I moved back here. I didn't want to leave. My favorite things to do on Thursday was go on the booze cruise. I don't drink. The fact is, though, as much as I enjoy those, you look over the side of that ship, it's trash, semi-buoyant trash all throughout there. And the sun sets in the most beautiful place just beyond the recently repurposed gas power plant. That was a recently coal gas power plant. Yeah, coal power plant. In fact, where I became engaged is my favorite beach in the Commonwealth. It's called Dead Horse Beach. That's right, in Salem. It's called Dead Horse Beach because that's where you brought your dead horse. It was the junkyard of its day. The tide would come and take it out to sea, and you never have to worry about it again. Weird shit, right? Industrialized cities. We don't have these things. So what is Plymouth? If we're not a post-industrial city, what are we? We're a post-nuclear city, of course. But what does post-nuclear mean? I have a lot of friends in the military, especially in the Navy. They're telling us that those folks who have some kind of a nuclear sub capability or technical skills, the pivot point for them, AI, robotics, quantum, for the most part, substantively exactly what we've been branding Plymouth as a place to encourage this type of development. And why also? Because it's the higher paying jobs. 16,000 people drive into this town every day to come to work. 23,000 drive out. The 16,000 people who drive into town every day, 60% of them are making under $40,000 a year. I deliberately waited to drink my own water because I spat it out when I heard that very stat I offered. It's absurd to think that the only reason we exist as the community, the one Plymouth that we exist as, is because we have a servant class of people who are willing to drive in here, be underpaid, and then they have to drive home, God willing, to have enough gas money. It's a good thing we're a safe community for the most part, because when you have that many people leaving this many restaurants with enough, I think we would have more incidents, which is why hotels and restaurants typically don't do well in normal industrialized urban environments. You have to have a robust security protocol in order for them to walk to their car at the end of the night with a pocket full of cash. There's 12,000 restaurant seats in Plymouth. That's relevant because Portsmouth, we all know Portsmouth, right? That's a city of 23,000 people. They have 30,000 restaurant seats. Half of Plymouth can drive to Portsmouth today, right now, and we will all have a seat waiting for us. Is that a place where we could grow? I think so. I think we're 3 times the size of Portsmouth. I think we have a year-round economy, unlike Portsmouth. And I do think that at 12,000 restaurant seats, compared to 30,000 restaurant seats for a city that's a third our size, there's a possibility for us to have a goal there, right? So working on things like food science and restaurants, stuff like that, We're really interested in doing things that's going to encourage more types of restaurants or even food trucks. The problem, though, with Plymouth built environment is that it's already it's built. It's not overbuilt. It's just as built as anyone wants it to get at this point. We have 3% vacancy in the downtown for commercial space. That's it, 3%. And there's literally 2 vacant commercial lots right now that are ready for development, and then we're done. We're out. We're tapped. No more commercial development unless it's going into a space that already exists. Fact, folks. Before the pandemic, 82% of the town's tax base was residential receipts. It's 87% now. Commercial has been stagnant. Someone goes out, someone goes in, someone goes out, someone goes in. There's nowhere to put anyone else. So one of the things we're working on right now at the foundation, we just put in a grant. I was able to assemble about $175,000. I'm hoping for another $100,000 so we can build a co-working space in the downtown. What's that going to achieve? Well, I can launch a few more businesses out of a co-working space, especially startups. They don't need much more than a desk, right? And then when they grow, hopefully it gives us enough of a runway that by the time they're ready to leave the co-working space, we will have solved their problem for them so they can grow in-house, right? So that's one thing that we're trying to do to help kind of ensure the economy without trying to build new things or do new things outside of an already built industrial or commercial footprint. I want to get into the Blue Future Conference. Last year we chose this initiative, See Deep in Innovation. We just settled on this year's, which is Plymouth at the helm. We're declaring ourselves leaders in the blue economy because we can prove it now. There are 78 coastal communities. I was in the midst of telling you how disgusting the North Shore was. Well, when you go around to Cape Cod, it's mostly national seashore. You're not doing much there. And then you get into Hyannis and some of their harbor and bay. Well, we know what's happening there because of the nitrogen levels, right? I mean, there's very little you can do there, too. They just have to throw out a whole batch of oysters because they were contaminated. And then you go south of us and you get into the South Shore, South Coast, and then you have New Bedford, which is the busiest port in the country and wealthiest for the last 35 years. You're not doing anything there either. It's already overbuilt. In fact, the state has a project right now. They're trying to build 43,000 square feet of space at their waterfront to help catalyze economic development in the city. And then you have Fall River and you get into Rhode Island, which is the Peloponnese of private estates. And frankly, they have a really robust, I'm going to show you a map in a moment, they have a really robust presence in oceanography, green-blue economy, but there's no place for those folks to grow. Which means Plymouth is really well situated to use our assets if you want them, because I'm just some guy, right? If you want to have these kinds of companies here, we have an opportunity to kind of lay the groundwork to entice them in. They're higher paying jobs. They solve environmental problems. They're conscientious, in fact, of green blue because that's how they started. It's not like a big national company that has to become green blue, right, and adopt these new policies. So what we did was essentially launch the conference 3 years ago. The idea was to essentially brand Plymouth and talk about what we have. The conference theme was casting a wide net. And we had aquaculture from oyster and kelp. And then we had some of the robotics companies. Did you guys know that we launched submarines out of Plymouth at Corvidge Park? Who knew that? No one knew that, right? No one knew that, but we do that. That's something we do. And we learned that during the first year's conference. Second year's conference, we called it Pulling Back the Curtain, and we actually had a live tech demonstration at Corvidge Park. We had 30 tech companies. All of this stuff is on our website, by the way. You can see some of the relics of those conferences, and we also exist on YouTube in an unedited fashion, but you can skip through pretty quick. But we learned a couple of things from having that live tech demo. We're actually not that well suited for all types of tech. We're learning these things because we're having these kinds of conversations, but we are also learning that there's quite a bit of interest from folks who want to be in Plymouth because, frankly, well, I'll tell you the secret. Green Sea, which is based at Corvidge Park, their corporate headquarters is Burlington, Vermont, where you can't launch submarines. So this is a company that knew they wanted to become more coastal. And where do they come? They could have been anywhere closer to where their base is. They chose Plymouth. They consolidated 3 companies under one umbrella, and they're growing in place at Corvidge. We can talk a little bit more about that. But first, one of the things that I want to get back to is some of the art stuff to tell you how you can tell a really cool story and an economic development strategy based on some of your arts. Henry David Thoreau spent time here in Plymouth in 1857, and he wrote in his journal about a sea monster myth that we have. And he describes it, but it got me thinking about the elements that the Pilgrims overcame. Because we can never, ever divorce ourselves from our identity, right? The Pilgrims are here to stay. But what doesn't sell right now about their story is colonialism and religious separatism, right? We have to come up with a new version of this story that still celebrates them, but doesn't necessarily antagonize people so that they may want to come here. I don't think anyone would deny their bold, intrepid entrepreneurship, right? I mean, you had to bring everything that you were going to have or make it when you got here. And the thing that's really cool about the Pilgrim story is, yes, they had a bold, intrepid entrepreneurial spirit. But when they got here, the only reason they were successful is because, well, they were met by 10,000 years of innovation. And that's really where the Wampanoag contribution comes in. A meaningful one, by the way. One that is quite literally tied and tethered to the success of the very colony itself. So when I was thinking about the sea monster myth and how it relates to entrepreneurs, got me thinking about that map that they used. So these sea serpents and dragons and impediments, if you will, they still got on the boat and they still sailed here. These were deeply pious people, right? I mean, if you believe in the man in the sky, you certainly believe in the demons in the deep. They made it, though, despite these. And that's worth celebrating. So I want to talk for a quick second about Henry David Thoreau and how we created this new conference and logo around, well, essentially something that has been part of our history for 150 years that we just never really celebrated. In his journal, he says these things. B.M. Watson, who's a very influential transcendentalist, tells me he learns from a pretty good authority that Webster once saw the sea serpent. It seems it was first seen in the bay between Manamet and Plymouth Beach. Now, when I heard that, I thought this. He goes on. By a perfect reliable witness who was accustomed to look out on the sea with his glass every morning, the first thing as regularly as he ate his breakfast. One morning he saw this monster with a head somewhat like a horse's, raised some 6 feet above the water, and his body the size of a cask trailing behind. The journal goes on to talk about the mackerel that beached themselves in such great numbers from their fright, and town folks came down and collected them from the beach. And then he talks about racing on a horse back to a tavern to beat a certain person he was with so they could get to the drinks first. It's a fascinating journal entry because he talks about this fantastical sea creature. He even mentions the resource, the guy behind it. And this is a common account. It says, an answer to the common account of this creature. So everyone knew what this thing was. What I find particularly interesting is the way he describes it is essentially, I'm a bit of a fan of mythology and lore, especially Celtic. He's describing a kelpie, a Scottish-Irish kelpie, one of those seahorses that lures you to its bag and then dives down deep and drowns you. It's an anti-drowning campaign for kids who were screwing around at the bogs and the cliffs, right? So one of the things I want to talk about, though, is the tangible economy of Plymouth and how I think that story is going to ultimately help us brand ourselves so that we are going to entice the types of investment and development in the green blue economy. At the last economy, we had 31 sponsors and partners. They help execute the conference program. Focused on things like innovation, robotics, AI, and quantum. I realize that basically says Iraq, and we're going to work on that acronym, but we're basically going to tell you that the strategy for economic development in Plymouth is an Iraqi strategy. The mass blue economy in 2022 boasts these numbers. You're looking at almost 5,900 businesses, 100,000 employees, 3.9 billion in wages, 8.2 billion GDP, and we're ranked 12 out of 30 coastal states. So just like the arts, is this a place where maybe we can grow? Just like the restaurants, is there room for us to compete with other states to enhance our output and portfolio? I think so. And what's really interesting, the mass blue economy numbers that you're looking at, 3/4 of those are tied to tourism. It's not even the robotics, AI, or quantum.
Or tied to what?
Tourism.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So those businesses, those 5,900 businesses, most of those are restaurants. Mm-hmm. 3.9 billion in wages. That's not nearly high enough. We can do so much better because I just told you 16,000 people who participate in the tourism economy are making about 40,000 a year. So if we have higher output with things like, I don't know, the Mayflower autonomous ship, how many people know about this? Maz? So you all know that it sailed itself here across the ocean by itself using solar power and AI. And you know that, of course, Plymouth is its home port. This thing has been traveling to a number of colleges and institutions so that it can be studied. This is our ambassador in a lot of ways for what blue economy is and can be. And look, very prominently you see IBM on there. I'm not saying we're getting any money from those guys, but I am telling you that it certainly does have some kind of a national value to people for businesses that are looking to do something like this. Right? This thing wasn't just some docile vessel sailing itself across. I mean, it was measuring salinity levels, temperatures, whale songs. In fact, we're working with a group this year. I'm sure you all know about whales and dolphins, right? They're part of our conference this year. There's a couple of things that they're working on, action item things that ultimately will receive whale song and then redirect the vessel so that it does not harm the pod. If you have enough of a warning, you can redirect this thing just a little bit, ever so slightly, and it'll be actually all the more economical. Okay? So I want to pause here and tell you about some of the things we're working with the town on. Some of you people already know about the climate action now, right? I was a part of that plan with Mark Reel when he was launching. In fact, I'm very proud to say I was part of the committee that identified that icon, right, as the thing we're going to go with. There's a whole story behind it. You should look into it. We're also working with Mike Cahill, his successor. When I started in Springfield 20 years ago, I was the one who wrote the application for green communities for Springfield. We were one of the very first. It took Plymouth almost 20 years to do that. I'm glad to say that Plymouth has adopted the green communities. They've also done the MVP, and they have raced past every other community by doing something bold, innovative, and new, which is the climate action now. It was a bit of a simmer, slow burn, if you will. But now they're demonstrating their chops, and the town has actually identified several policy areas that they're going to be working on. And I think most of us would agree, well, I mean, almost all of these things is a technically economic development, right? Including waste, because economic development is about enhancing quality of life. Does anyone want to live next to a dump or in an industrial park? I did both of those things when I was in my childhood in Orleans. It's one of the things that instilled in me very early on the necessity of urban for land use and proper zoning, separation of spaces. No one should live in an industrial park, an oldie tiny type of industrial park. No one should live next to a dump. The town has unique policy authority over so that they can do things that's going to position us for the green-blue economy. They're a partner in this. And I only included this slide so you understand that. We're not doing anything ourselves. I'm going to talk only very quickly about the Holtec site, because I know some of you are interested, and it's something that we're working on recently with the town. We wrote the application. We're basically going to follow the application to the USEDA, the Economic Development Administration. They're typically an organization that works in chronically distressed communities, right, where you have entrenched poverty generation after generation. That's not who we are. But because of that decommissioning, we are fit into a special category for funding from the feds because of the decommissioning. In fact, any application we put forward, we only have to match 20%. Typically, community like Plymouth would have, the one Plymouth community would have to match 50%. So we're in a unique position. We're also competing with 15 other communities that are going through a decommissioning. We are greedy little pigs, folks. We are gobbling up as much of this money as we can. In fact, the town got $3.2 million for water and sewer improvements. We got $300,000 to do the entrepreneurial study. We got another $300,000 to do this. So all told, out of a $15 billion pot, we're taking ours. We're very active, very aggressive about making sure we're well positioned. These are some of the things that we're going to be studying for these 1,500 acres. It's 1,500 acres, but we do know that we're not going to get all 1,500 acres developed. In fact, about 2/3 of that is going to have to be put in some kind of conservation. We believe that there's about 494 acres of developable land. Okay? These are our goals, though, that's specifically stated in the application: to avoid environmentally sensitive assets and resources, minimize impacts to adjacent properties, minimize topographic and infrastructure costs, provide a variety for new economic development opportunities, and maximize fiscal benefit to the town. Right? I just told you that 87% of the town's tax base you're paying. You're paying. If you're cool with that, well, I get to go home pretty much on time every night for the next 5 years. If you're not cool with that, the next half decade of my life is going to be very busy. But really, it's only up to you. I get to go home otherwise, right? Just at what time? This is going to be the next big economic development project in this town, and you're all going to have a say on what you want to have done there. That's why we wrote the application. That's why we're running it like a master plan process, coterminous with the town's master plan. It's my hope and expectation that the master plan committee will adopt the Holtec master plan as an addendum to the whole master plan. They may not, though, and that's okay too. But the fact is, we do have a federally paid for plan that we're working on. This was a proposed subdivision that came out of the RKG report. I'm not telling you this because it's gospel. I'm telling you this because it was the more dynamic map that I could show you, which is essentially this, right? You're looking at State Road here. You're looking at about, what would they have here?